first outline. Welcome to the first outline planning seminar of 2025. I hope you all had a good break over the holiday period. Our session today is a special focus on a sector that seems to be dominating not just the planning system, but a lot of the real estate world recently, which is data centres, a topic dear to my heart and also dear to the heart of my colleague who joins me today, Pieter Claussen, who is a senior associate in the planning team. So morning, Peter, and welcome to you.
Morning, Trevor.
And really, the data centres have become a growing part of our practice and have become a huge part of our practice over the last few years, but with real challenges delivering them through the planning system. And the reason we thought today we would focus on the topic of data centres is firstly an interesting appeal decision that we've been involved with, but also the change perhaps in attitude towards data centre planning resulting from the change of government in the election back in the summer of last year, recent changes to policy. So that's the sort of context really for talking about data centres here and now rather than any other point. And I think probably the place to start is with the recent planning appeal, which was an appeal, and Peter, I'll ask you just to sort of set out the background to the appeal shortly, but an appeal that the inquiry took place in June last year. So at the time of the inquiry, we were envisaging it being determined by a planning inspector under the previous Conservative government and before the election, which we all thought would be a little bit later than it was. In the event, of course, the election happened in July, and I think the first act possibly of the new Deputy Prime Minister and Secretary of State Planning, Angela Rayner, one of the first things she did was to recover the determination of this particular appeal and another data centre appeal, but for her to decide personally at the very same day. That was the very first day, I think, of the Labour government, wasn't it, Peter, from memory?
It was, yep.
And at the same time, the Chancellor referenced the decision to recover those two appeals in the first speech she gave on economic growth. So the signs were perhaps promising from that point forward as to where the government were going in terms of importance of data centres. And so we waited, as ever. These things took a little bit longer because the Secretary of State had recovered it. It took a bit longer to get to a decision. But just before Christmas, we had the Christmas present of the decision on this data centre site. As I understand it, the other data centre appeal that was recovered hasn't yet been released as a decision. So we still only have this one to go on as an indication of where the new Secretary of State and the new government sit in terms of their appetite for data centre planning. But let's start with the appeal. So Court Lane was the property in Ivor, wasn't it, Peter? But just talk us through sort of the background to the appeal first, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, Trevor, Court Lane industrial estate in Ivor, outline application for a hyperscale data centre went in, I think, late 2022. That was refused in October 23. We then lodged the appeal late January, early February 24, and as you said, Trevor, the inquiry was in June. We were then recovered on the 8th of July. In terms of the site itself, as I said, it was an industrial estate in its purest form. I would say it was quite fairly grotty, sort of cherry pickers everywhere, industrial type buildings. In the middle of that sat a Grade 2 listed building. It's right next to the M25 and next to a water treatment works. And on top of all of that, it's in the Greenbelt, although I think we'd probably describe it loosely as Greenbelt and in name only.
Yeah, although Greenbelt certainly at the time was Greenbelt.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll come on to Greenbelt in a bit, but Greenbelt was Greenbelt. And of course, this is an area, Buckinghamshire in large chunks of Buckinghamshire really are under massive pressure for demand for data centre sites, falling both within the Slough and the Hayes availability zones, which are key zones for hyperscale data centers, particularly focused on cloud computing. That is where the ideal location is for these sites. So Buckinghamshire have faced something of an onslaught of these applications, and sort of in the run up to our appeal, there had been an appeal on a site very similar, actually, similar site in a very similar location at Link Park, where that had gone to an appeal, and that appeal had been refused. The appeal decision was ultimately quashed for technical reasons, but then I think the application was then withdrawn, so it was never redetermined. But there had been a refusal there, and then the Woodlands site, also in Ivor, had been refused, and that one, interestingly, was refused by Michael Gove as the then Secretary of State. He'd recovered that one and turned it down largely on Greenbelt grounds. So there had been a sort of history of Greenbelt and other sites being refused by Bucks for these schemes.
And I think that Woodlands one is back in, isn't it? And there's been an inquiry since. They've gone in again for Woodlands.
They have indeed. Yeah. I think the inquiries happened, and they're now waiting for a decision. Yeah. So in that framework, I think when you look at the appeal decision, and what is it we should take away from the appeal decision, as you've just said, Peter, that the site had, as all sites do, its own peculiarities, and as ever, the appeal is determined on the particular merits and in the context of a particular site. But I think for me, there are certain areas where there are some really important lessons that we can take away. And the first one of those is just focusing on the Greenbelt scenario. We all know Greenbelt has hitherto been sacrosanct to a greater extent. So the site was in the Greenbelt. We accepted that the building, because it was a very large building, because it was a hyperscale data center, would have a greater impact on openness than the existing development. So notwithstanding it being previously developed land, it was common ground between the parties that under the then framework, it was inappropriate development in the Greenbelt, and therefore there would need to be very special circumstances in order to justify it. And I think when you look at the decision, the Secretary of State has agreed with all of that and has attached substantial weight, in her words, substantial weight to the Greenbelt harm, that being the harm to openness, albeit an acknowledgement there was a limited impact on openness, and also some harm, in her words, to the purposes of the Greenbelt designation. So I think we have a site here where it's in the Greenbelt. It is acknowledged that there is harm to the Greenbelt, and the Secretary of State attached substantial weight to it. So that sort of feels to me as if this wasn't, although we would say this was fairly grotty Greenbelt, and we would certainly now say grey belt.
Grey belt, yeah.
But although we would say that, nonetheless, the Secretary of State was prepared to accept the Council's case that, yes, there was harm to Greenbelt, and to attach substantial weight to that Greenbelt harm. And I think that's interesting in terms of its application elsewhere, where there is Greenbelt harm, and potentially on sites that are higher quality Greenbelt than the site that we were faced with. Was that the fact that there was substantial harm didn't prevent the inspector from the Secretary of State rather from ultimately deciding that was outweighed by the very special circumstances.
Yeah, and I think for me that is interesting moving forwards, notwithstanding what we've now got with the NPPF, that sort of baseline position of the willingness to consider VSC notwithstanding, very special circumstances, notwithstanding that Greenbelt harm that actually was common ground, as you said, Trevor. I think is a big sort of talking point for data centers and a real positive moving forwards.
Yeah. And it's sort of it's interesting when you look at some of the more site-specific stuff that we don't want to spend a lot of time on.
Yeah,
it's particularly interesting. But the decision, there were a number of points, most points where actually the Secretary of State decided to come down in favour of the Council's case. So Greenbelt harm, substantial weight,
yep.
Fine. But impacts on landscape. Some of the heritage impacts, she recognised there were some heritage benefits, but also recognised some heritage harms. And I think the really interesting one to me was the development plan, and that old chestnut of uh, my mantra of Section 38(6) being at the heart of everything, as it should be. Actually, the Secretary of State went on to find conflict with the development plan overall. So
Yeah.
we were faced with a situation where we've got a statutory test of determination in accordance with the development plan, unless there are material considerations to the contrary. A finding that we conflict with the development plan in a number of ways, actually, in the end. Then a finding that applying the greenbelt policies of the then version of the framework as a material consideration, finding harm to greenbelt and attaching substantial weight to that. So everything, the way that the Secretary of State's approached the decision is to kind of set everything up against the proposal. And I know you and I would say some of that we think is a little unfair. We think we had a much stronger case than that on a number of those points. But I sort of feel as if there's a message being sent here. I sort of feel as if there was almost a decision by the Secretary of State to agree with the Council's case as much as possible and say, notwithstanding all of this, I'm still going to approve because data centres are so important, and we'll sort of come on to that analysis in a minute. But it feels as if there's kind of quite a deliberate attempt here to show that even when the bar is very high, this Secretary of State, unlike perhaps previous Secretaries of State, is willing to consider that bar can be overcome in order to meet the need for data centres. And that's a really important point for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, reading between the lines, because a lot of it is planning judgment, because of everything is being weighed in the balance and then coming down in favour of development being granted, for me, that almost makes the decision impenetrable in terms of a statutory challenge, because it's planning judgment and the courts just won't get involved with planning judgment at that point. And actually, for me, I think the Secretary of State is sending that message, but she's trying to send a message that actually you're not going to be able to challenge this either, because it's planning judgment, and this is my planning judgment, and this is actually how I want this type of development to proceed moving forwards. And I think for me that's me reading between the lines. That's not said anywhere, but I think actually it's quite a good decision in that respect, because she's done what you've said, Trevor. They come down on everything, not everything, but where there is a positive case for the council, it's been found in favour of the council. Yet the planning balance has still come down in favour of the development.
Yeah, so a really good point. And so I think kind of fine. So lots of things go against approval, including conflict with the development plan. But it is that very special circumstances, the VSC tests that she applies in the framework. And there are a number of things, if you go through the decision, there are lots of things that she identifies as VSC, particularly around heritage, and they're very site specific. So I suspect probably not very interesting to the audience today. But I think there are two that are really, really important in terms of data centers. The first one of those for me is how she deals with the need for data centers. And I think you read her decision and the inspector's report, the very comprehensive inspector's report that she's basing it on. There's a recognition in there of the importance of the Slough and Hayes availability zones and the need to deliver data centers within those zones. And that one of the lines that came out to me was the recognition that a failure to meet that need in the Slough and Hayes AZs could have, and the quote I've written down here is significant negative consequences for the UK digital economy. That's a big statement. If you don't meet that need here, it's not just going to have local consequences, it's not just going to have regional consequences, it's going to have significant consequences for the UK digital economy. And that very much, barely a day goes by when the government isn't talking about how the digital economy is going to be key to economic growth, which is a big mantra at the moment for very obvious reasons. Just yesterday we had Starmer talking about AI and again data centers and the power that drives them coming through as part of that, making sure that the UK is at the forefront of the AI revolution. So I just think that's a really powerful statement by the Secretary of State that will be looked at by inspectors and ought to be looked at by planning authorities when they're considering these sites, particularly in those, not just necessarily the Slough and Hayes AZs, but actually some of the others as well. But recognition that there is a very locational specific requirement for these data centres in a number of cases, but that the failure to meet it within that area has a UK-wide impact on the economy.
I think that was a really key moment in the inquiry itself, Trevor, as well, was when we presented our case on need. It actually went uncontested by the council. That they effectively conceded to our need case, but at the end of examination in chief, we came to the inspector's questions, and the inspector sort of said in broad terms, well, what happens if this and like developments don't come forwards? And our witness effectively stood up and said, well, the UK is going to lose its data center prowess. Operators and developers will get fed up of what's going on and how many hoops there are to jump through in the UK system. And they'll go to other areas in Europe which are more amenable to data center development, and it's just easier to get through, notwithstanding, as you said, Trevor, the Slough Haze availability zones and the UK being such a key player in the data center economy at the moment globally.
I think one of the other interesting things that came out of the need evidence was the scale of that need.
Yeah.
For me, so I think we were talking about 1,900 megawatts rising to sort of 2,500 megawatts just in the Slough and Haze AZ in the next sort of 10 years. The 1,900 was sort of the next 3 to 5 years, and then going up to 2.5 in the next decade. It was and interesting that the council didn't contest that need case. They accepted that the need was that great, but that's very strong. And having now been endorsed by the Secretary of State, that level of need is sort of established, and it will be difficult, I think, for that to be resiled from moving forward in terms of the scale. Just in this one location, Slough and Haze, that's not looking at the rest of the UK's requirement.
And I think for me there were 2 points on that. I think the first is that the evidence that we presented was that even if every application in the Slough Haze corridor was approved, that was currently before the various authorities, there would still be a significant shortfall, and in terms of the need for data centers in that area. And the second point was that even if all of the power in the new Uxbridge Moor proposed substation was used for data centers, there'd still be a shortfall of, I think it was about 1,000 megawatts of IT power against the current need. That's massive. So, and actually moving, and that's assuming that Uxbridge is delivered soon, which the reality is it's not got planning permission yet, so it's not even happening. So by the time Uxbridge Moor is built, that need is surely only going to be exponentially greater.
Yeah. But there's an interesting point there with the power, because one of the dangers with running a need case in any planning argument is that if you're basing the justification for your scheme on need, then you need to be able to demonstrate that your scheme is deliverable in order to meet that need. And there's a helpful line from the inspector around power, because of course there's uncertainty as the timing of when the new power at Uxbridge will come on stream, which could potentially be a question mark over the deliverability of a particular site to meet the need. But I think the point with the inspector, the Secretary of State doesn't dwell on it, but in the inspector's report, he makes the point that because the need is so great, the need won't have been met by the time the power is available, and therefore sites that are dependent on that power are still going to be meeting that need because there's no other way of meeting it in advance. So I think there's some interesting stuff there if you're wrestling with whether your site is deliverable in order to meet the need because of uncertainty around timing of power. That there's an interesting line there in the inspector's report that's worth looking at, that recognises that there aren't other sites with power that can meet this need. So the need is going to exist until such time as the power is delivered. Therefore, this site can meet that need, notwithstanding that uncertainty. I think, therefore, so just rounding up that conversation around need, I think what the Secretary of State goes on to say is, well, actually, I'm giving significant weight to that need, and that's fine, that's great, significant weight to that need that was uncontested. But she goes on, and I think, as well as saying significant weight in the context of the decision, there was also a recognition that this one data centre would in itself be making a significant contribution to meeting both local and UK need. Yeah. And that, again, I thought was a really powerful line around sort of any attempt by an authority to say, well, this is just one data center. You know, the need is so great that this is just going to be a drop in the ocean because we're only dealing with one, which is something that when you look at housing, sometimes seen where there's an undersupply of housing in an area, you've seen local authorities sort of say, yes, but this is only an application for 5 units. It's not going to make a big difference. And sometimes I've seen that get traction. But here, in the context of data centers, there appears to be a recognition from the Secretary of State, we are only going to meet this need one data center at a time. And therefore, a hyperscale data center of this sort of size is in itself making a significant contribution to meeting the national need as well as local. That, again, I think is a very powerful statement of support for data center development moving forward.
Yeah, I completely agree. And once I'd got over the initial excitement of just skipping to whether it said appeal allowed or dismissed, I then read the decision letter in the old-fashioned way and read the inspector's report first. And actually, I was not disappointed, but there was more mention of the Slough-Hayes corridor than there was of the UK need. And actually, I think the Secretary of State's gone further, and it's helpful when you read her decision. She's agreed that there's a need in the Slough-Hayes corridor, but she's actually gone one step further and said, well, actually, there is this UK need, which is a really important point for me.
Yeah. We're getting quite a few questions, so we need to get through what we want to say in order that we've got time to get to questions at the end, because we will, as always, make sure we finish within the hour. We won't overrun, because that's just rude. So I think the other big point for me on the decision, before we perhaps move on to looking at the policy changes since in the framework, is around economic impact and particularly job creation, because I think certainly historically there has been an allegation that data centers don't create jobs at big empty buildings. And I can hear all our data center clients screaming that I've just said that, because they'll be saying, no, that's not the case. And I know that's not the case. But that has been the allegation. And of course, that isn't the case. There are jobs created on site. But it's quite often being used when you're looking to convert existing B uses, existing employment and industrial space to data center. There's been a sort of suggestion that there's a loss of jobs, and therefore, actually, that's not good, given that the local plan will be looking to increase jobs in order to support housing growth and all the rest of it. So there's been a sort of a job loss reason for refusal quite often levelled, and a criticism levelled at data centres. So I think this is another area where there's some really good stuff that people can now point at, because again, as the evidence wasn't contested by the local authority, but the Secretary of State placed significant weight on the economic benefits and particularly job creation. Now, the evidence was that there were 50 full-time equivalent jobs on site at present as a sort of scrappy industrial site. Our evidence was that there would be 90 full-time equivalent jobs on site, so an increase in jobs. That's the first point for me. There was no challenge to the idea that there were a significant number of jobs being created on site anyway. So there was a recognition that actually there's quite a large employment on site for this. Also a recognition that those jobs that are being created on site are actually quite skilled jobs, and particularly skilled in tech and data. So a value in those jobs as well, compared to potentially some of the lower value jobs that they might be replacing on employment sites, existing employment sites. But actually the big one for me is the recognition of the downstream job creation in the wider economy. And our evidence was that a hyperscale data center of this size creates in the economy at large 6,300 full-time equivalent jobs. That wasn't contested. It was accepted by the Secretary of State and the inspector, and weight placed on it. And I think part of the criticism was made there was, well, okay, these jobs are in other industries, other businesses that are supported by having data center capacity in the UK, but they're not necessarily going to be created locally. And it's interesting to me that pretty short shrift was given to that argument, as the point was made in the decision that it doesn't matter. There's no requirement that the jobs have to be created locally. A job is a job is a job. And that level of jobs, whether they're created in Buckinghamshire, whether they're created in London, the South East, or elsewhere in the UK economy, that is a significant material consideration that weight can be attached to. And I think that was a really important point for me sort of perhaps hopefully starts to draw a line under this sort of nonsense allegation that's thrown at data centers that you're not creating any jobs, you're just a big empty box. There's a recognition that actually we're creating far more jobs when you look at the wider job creation within the economy that comes from having data center capacity.
Yeah, and actually, this is a really useful decision now to put in front of local planning authorities who will inevitably continue to argue that there is no job creation, and actually, it's a useful decision in that respect. So, well, actually, you're wrong. It is creating jobs, and it actually doesn't matter where those jobs are, because the evidence that the council's planning officer gave at Buckinghamshire was that no wage attached to these 6,300 jobs, and obviously the inspector and the Secretary of State have since dismissed that.
Yeah. There's one more point which is a sort of geeky planning point, so I'm going to make it really quickly. But for the hardcore planners on the call, there was an interesting argument. I think the council, we were arguing that another very special circumstance was that this was previously developed land. This was a brownfield site. The council tried to argue that we couldn't rely on that because the way the framework policies on Greenbelt apply, if it's previously developed land and there's no greater impact on openness, then you're not in appropriate development. What the council was saying was because there was a greater impact on openness, the fact it was previously developed land was irrelevant. And the inspector gave quite short shrift to that. So, well, that's just nonsense. Yes, because there's an impact on openness, it is inappropriate development, but that doesn't change the fact this is a brownfield site. And we should still be looking to bring forward brownfield sites rather than greenfield sites. So, notwithstanding that you couldn't exempt yourself from being in appropriate development, you could still take into account as a material consideration in its own right the fact that this was a previously developed brownfield site. I think that's just an interesting point to note on the side, not specific to data centers, but clearly
yeah. So
applications.
I know you said that was the last one, but I'm just going to jump in with one more of general applicability. Sorry, and I think it's HGV movements because there was a problem with HGVs in either, and the main policy that allocated the site for redevelopment was largely entrenched in reducing HGV movements. But I think generally data centers don't generate large HGV movements, and actually looking forward at the types of sites that we're looking at the moment, they are industrial estates with a B8 use that you're looking to shift into a data center use, and that there is more than likely to be a reduction in HGV movement. So it's just one to keep in your back pocket as a material consideration moving forwards, I think.
That's the last. You've had a last and I've had a last. So
well, we were just talking about whether we're going to do the 106, but I'm not sure if you.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
You're proud of this. Again, a point that isn't data center specific, but
it's not.
But actually a really important point for planning in general. So yeah.
Yeah. So ultimately, to cut a long story short, there is no legal basis for local planning authorities to recover their legal costs in the context of negotiating a Section 106 agreement, or in our case, a unilateral undertaking. Now, I think that is obviously useful to know. The reality is that if you're negotiating with a cooperative local planning authority, you will simply just give them the however many thousands they're asking for their legal fees, because it's easier to do that than have the argument. But if you are in an uncontested scenario like we were here, you can simply say, look, we're going to do a unilateral undertaking, and we're not covering the cost of the council's fees.
It was an interesting argument because the council fought quite hard on that.
Yeah.
And it's been a point that I've long considered. There's no legal basis for requiring legal fees to be paid. But most local authorities are sensible enough, when faced with me threatening to run that argument in inquiry, they tend to back off and just drop the point, because they don't want a decision that says what our decision now says. But it is, and we'll do a separate briefing on, I think, the implications for Section 106 in general of it. But yeah, really important point. The Secretary of State has agreed with us that there is no legal basis for requiring legal fees, and that, here the legal fees were fairly minor. But if you're doing development, particularly in some of the London boroughs, the legal fees can be quite a big chunk of money. There is, as you say, you probably still end up paying them if you want to get a planning planning permission out of the local authority. But if you find yourself in an appeal, you can offset some of the costs of the appeal, I suppose, by at least telling the local authority where to go in terms of its legal fees for the 106. Is that our final point? And
I think so. There's more to say on the 106, but we'll do that separately.
We'll do that another time. So I think the important point, bringing all that together, conflict with the development plan, harm to Greenbelt, and yet very special circumstances outweighed all of that, notably the need and the job creation. And I suppose the link into the NPPF is all of that was done without the new NPPF. So it was done on the basis of planning policy as was with the 2003 version of the framework. So that I think is interesting in and of itself, that even in the more restrictive policy environment that existed in November, as opposed to what happened in December, the Secretary of State was still willing to approve the scheme on that basis. Looking now at the other big change that I think hits data centre planning in the last few weeks is the changes to the National Planning Policy Framework that were a sort of early Christmas gift, I suppose, to the industry from Angela Rayner as Secretary of State. And we're not going to look at all of it today, but what we're going to do is look at the bits that are very relevant to data centres. And I mean, data centres are name checked in the framework in a number of different locations. And I think just to sort of underline that is unusual. Housing is talked about in national planning policy as a topic in its own right constantly, but specific forms of economic development are just aren't. So it's the mere fact that data centres and other sectors around that sort of the growth of digital economy, life sciences, they have now crept in, but it's quite unprecedented. To say actually the government is going to start to highlight particular areas that it wants to support, and we shouldn't underestimate, I don't think, what that means in terms of the signalling that's coming out of central government as to the backing that they're going to be prepared to give to data centres in particular. And critically, it's not just data centres they talk about, it's data centres and the grid connections that are necessary in order to power them. As we all know, power being absolutely key to driving data centre development. That in itself is a big step forward, I think. And so it's worth looking at those sections that are dealing specifically with data centres and probably Greenbelt as well. So, I mean, chapter 6 is the one that looks at economic development as opposed to housing. So chapter 6 is probably the best place to start, isn't it, Peter? And as ever with the framework, it's doing two things. It's telling local authorities how they should bring forward their local plans and their planning policies, and it's telling them how to determine applications. And I probably want to start, if you don't mind, Peter, with the plan making side of it, because that is interesting in terms of what it's telling local authorities they need to do in the context of data centres when they're making and bringing forward new local plans, which many of them are now going to have to do as a result of publication of the framework. We'll see a lot of them starting to come forward quite quickly, I suspect. And paragraph 86 for me is saying what local authorities need to do in terms of economic development when they're bringing forward plans. And 86B, there's one word that's changed in 86B, but I think it's important. It used to say that policies should set criteria or identify strategic sites to match need for economic development. I paraphrase the end of that, but it's that first bit, set criteria or identify strategic sites. The or has been replaced with an and that although that is a small change, I think it's a really important one, because local authorities are now being told that new plans can't just set criteria as to how they're going to consider applications for economic development. They now need to identify strategic sites to meet the need. And when you read through, I'm not going to go through the wording, but when you read through, the need is referenced back in the introductory section of paragraph 86 to the new National Economic Strategy, which includes data centres. And that's recognised. So it seems to me that one word change is now creating a requirement particularly if you're in one of the availability zones, if you're in Slough, Hayes or elsewhere, it's creating a requirement on you because there is a need for data centers in those locations. Your local plans, I think, in order to be sound, need to be identifying the strategic sites that are going to meet the need, not contribute to, meet the need.
Yeah.
That's a massive requirement on a local authority like, for example, Buckinghamshire, which finds itself in the middle of one of the, or two, in its case, of the AZs. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it sort of it goes back to the need case that we made on Court Lane, just how important need is. But actually, I think it's here now in black and white. And actually, your point, Trevor, is hammered home in 86C, isn't it, of the NPPF, where actually data centers are name checked for the first time in the NPPF, and tells us that planning policies should pay particular regard to facilitating data center development, I paraphrase, to meet the needs of a modern economy, including by identifying suitable locations. So again, planning policies now have to address that need, and I think that is quite interesting of itself, particularly when you start to look at, well, what happens if there's planning policies or a development plan that doesn't do this, that doesn't identify strategic sites, that doesn't identify where data centers are going to go. And for me, you then get back into paragraph 11, Trevor, and the tilted balance.
I think you do, and probably just before we go to paragraph,
yeah, it's decision taking. Yeah,
86, yes, but also 87.
Exactly.
87,
yeah,
87. Paragraph 87 then says you've got to recognise the specific locational requirements of particular sectors, and again, data centres and grid connections are specifically name checked there. So again, looking at those availability zones and saying, actually, you've got to recognise that it might be a UK need, but that UK need, you might need to meet quite a large proportion of it because there is a specific locational requirement for those data centres. So I think all of that pulls together. And what I would say before we go on to sort of paragraph 11, so that is a really important point. The challenge, I think, for the industry is going to be how they engage with the plan making process in order to make sure that the evidence is front of inspectors when they're considering whether plans are sound. Because these things won't happen by magic, they won't happen by osmosis. We as an industry are going to have to perhaps be more engaged with the plan making process in order to make sure the policy framework is as it should be. In the same way as house builders have been for a long time, they've been very heavily engaged with making sure that housing supply, housing allocations are right. I'm not sure the data center sector has been that sophisticated with planning yet. There's a challenge, I think, to the industry as to how they now engage, with, particularly in those key areas, the AZs, actually making sure they have a seat at the table when a plan is coming forward in order to make sure the policy framework is right for when they come to bring forward their applications. If you've got a site now, you ought to be looking to promote it through the local plan as a data centre in the same way as you would if you had a housing site. That's just a sort of point. It's all good news, but it's only good news if we now take the opportunity that's been given to us and run with it.
And I think the other point, Trevor, we talked earlier about the need case that was presented at Court Lane, and that went uncontested. But I can't, given the plateau that need is now being put upon, I can't see local authorities are just going to roll over in the same way that the Bucks did on Court Lane. They are probably going to start looking at their own need evidence, given how important need is now, and trying to at least. I'm not sure. I think it's an undisputed need. So I'm not saying they have a case there, but I am saying that perhaps it might not be as rosy as it was for us in terms of the need case moving forwards.
I think it's a good point, and particularly if that need case hasn't been presented when the plan was made.
Yeah.
If the plan is based on a certain evidence base on need, which the local authority has been driving, and you then come along at application stage and say, "Oh no, the need is different." Well, hold on a minute. Why did you not say that when the plan was coming forward? The development plan now is what it is.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree. I think that getting the need case right, challenging the local authority's need case, and making sure that inspectors, both at plan making and decisions, if they're at appeal, can see it is going to be really critical. But there is so I think that those are the requirements. Now, of course, that will take time. particularly on the plan making side. It's going to take time for planning authorities to bring forward new plans and for all of that to settle down. So in the meantime, I think that link back to paragraph 11 and the infamous presumption in favour of sustainable development is really important. I think you were about to go on and mention that, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of decision taking, it's if there are no relevant development plan policies, or the policies which are most important for determining that application are out of date, it means granting planning permission unless there's a strong reason for refusing the development proposed. That there are other points to that, but for me that's an interesting point, because I think we start to get ourselves into territory of a presumption in favour of development and in favour of planning permission being granted for data centres where there is that need.
Yeah, I think that's right. So if the framework is now in force, a local plan that is already in place clearly doesn't reflect the framework in a number of ways. You can't automatically put it to one side, but in this context, if an existing plan is not, and let's face it, none of them do, allocating land to meet the need for data centers and for their grid connections. Really important. We remember that hand there. If it's not doing that, then arguably its policies are out of date, and as a result, you then get to apply the presumption in favour of sustainable development. And this is something which housing has been doing ever since the framework was first published in 2012. So as a planning industry, we're very comfortable with the presumption, but this is new territory that we potentially take it into, which becomes quite significant for data centers and the supporting infrastructure, grid connections and such like that are needed to bring them forward, and poses real challenges for local planning authorities. I keep saying it, but there's a theme here, isn't there? Particularly in those in the availability zones.
Well, I think it's almost made all development plan policies out of date at present, certainly the ones that we've seen. There aren't many allocating data center development. Yeah. So it's a really interesting point.
Yeah. The question is whether it's that is the most relevant policy for the determination. I think I suspect if you're in Greenbelt or something, the planning authority would say, "Oh no, it's the Greenbelt policies." But you've got that argument. But no, I think there's quite a compelling case, almost across the board, to say policies are out of date in the context of meeting data center need.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you want to touch on footnote 7? I know that you were quite excited about this when we were talking about it yesterday.
But footnote 7. So footnote 7 is where the presumption doesn't apply, which is sort of historically, if you're in Greenbelt, AONB, dealing with listed buildings, those sorts of more sensitive locations. The footnote 7 itself has been reworded. So it doesn't identify the areas now; it identifies those policies relevant. But the key is it's that second part of para 11D. It's no longer about whether being in the Greenbelt or being in AONB or near a listed building is a reason for refusal, and whether those policies go against. It's whether it creates a strong reason for refusal, which I think, again, is just raising the bar for a local authority trying to disapply the presumption in favour of sustainable development. That creates a greater opportunity for the presumption to apply, even in those areas with those sort of higher levels of protection through other parts of the framework that are set out in footnote 7. So I think it's an interesting point. That probably links us in, conscious of time, links into the last big topic I think we ought to cover on the framework, which is the changes to Greenbelt, which have a broader application than just data centres. But given that a number of data centre sites do find themselves in the Greenbelt, particularly in the Buckinghamshire area, poor old Bucks, the Greenbelt policies are important. And I think there's some interesting changes there. The first one for me will come onto Greybelt. Greybelt's been much talked about. Greybelt's clearly relevant. But actually, even if you're not Greybelt, there are changes to Greenbelt policy that I think are interesting. And paragraph 146 is one that comes out for me, which is a recognition that those exceptional circumstances that would justify whether it's removing land from the Greenbelt or looking at applications in the Greenbelt. Those exceptional circumstances include being unable to meet the need for commercial development through other means. So coming back to the Court Lane discussion and the scale of the unmet need for data centres in the Buckinghamshire area and beyond, that inability to meet that need without coming into the Greenbelt is itself an exceptional circumstance now under 146 to justify looking at Greenbelt sites, even if they're not Greybelt sites. So I think that's a really interesting point. That some of those previous appeal decisions that went the other way, where they were Greenbelt sites, actually might be back in play now.
Yeah, absolutely, and that follows through, Trevor, into 155B, where again it's talking about the development of homes and where it wouldn't be an appropriate development if there's a demonstrable unmet need for the type of development proposed. So again, it's a clear message, isn't it?
Yeah. So that was kind of point number one. But then the other big one is Greybelt, which would have been very relevant at Court Lane. It would have been very relevant at the previous appeal at Link Park that I referred to earlier, and I'm sure it's been raised in the context of Woodlands, the other site in Ivor that we talked about earlier that has recently had an inquiry. And it's this idea of Greybelt, recognizing that not all Greenbelt is of the same quality. And the definition of Greybelt is previously developed land. So if you're previously developed land, or if you're other land that doesn't strongly contribute to the purposes of the Greenbelt, and actually it's only limited purposes. It's only purposes A, B, and D that are set out in paragraph 143. So if you're not strongly contributing to those purposes, then you fit within potentially the definition of Greybelt. That's a bit of a paraphrasing there. There's a bit more detail to it. You've got to look at footnote 7 as well. We've already talked about that. But suddenly a lot of sites, and Court Lane, I am convinced, would have been Greybelt, notwithstanding the listed building, because I'm not sure the listed building creates a strong reason for refusal. I think it's just an obvious Greybelt site under the definition as is in the framework. Then you're Greybelt, and the consequence of that is interesting in that you are effectively not inappropriate development if you're bringing forward commercial development on Greybelt. You're not inappropriate, therefore you don't need to show very special circumstances, as long as you meet the criteria that's set out in the remainder of the policy. And I'm not sure we need to go through it all in great detail, because I think this has been heavily trailed already, and much discussed over the course of the consultation on the draft that was published last year. But yeah, the Greybelt has made it into policy with a direct application to commercial development, which includes data centres. And actually, I think it's quite clear when you look at what's been said by the government. Part of the reason for this is to allow data centre type development as well as housing to come forward in those areas that are constrained by Greenbelt.
Conscious of time, Trevor, and actually, one of the things I was going to move on to, which has actually come up in a question, so can cover them at the same time, is this designation of data centres as critical national infrastructure, and what that means for planning. Spoilers, I think both you and I agree that actually it doesn't mean very much for planning. And I'll tell you why. I think so. In September last year, the technology secretary designated data centres as critical national infrastructure, or CNI. Now, there's no legal definition of what CNI is, but if you go on, if you start looking at CNI, you quickly find that they are part of the National Protective Security Authority and an arm of MI5, and what they are doing is sort of building resilience to national security threats. And if you follow the sort of definitions that the NPSA has for critical national infrastructure, it's all about protecting threats such as terrorism or espionage and all those sorts of things. It's protecting development that already exists rather than talking about bringing development forwards. And actually, if you look at the NPPF, there's no mention of critical national infrastructure in it when data centers were designated as CNI. There was no mention at all of how this would play with planning. So for me, it doesn't add much. I mean, I'm sure that the clever planning agents amongst you will argue that it's a material consideration, and there might be some buy-in for that. But I don't know. What are your thoughts, Trevor?
Yeah, and I've seen some people arguing that it
Yeah,
is a sort of weighty material consideration. I think you're right. The designation itself is not a planning designation. It's about recognizing that there's a national security function played by data centers, and therefore, in the event of national emergencies, a higher level of protection needs to be given to them because they're critical to running the UK and UK economy. So, in that sense, it's not relevant to planning. It's about emergency planning, disaster recovery planning, all the rest of it. But I think for me, what it does show is just this sort of continuing focus that the government has, not just within planning, but across the piece, this recognition that there's a real threat to the UK economy and to the UK as an entity if we don't have sufficient data center capacity available. So it just underlines the importance. But I agree with you, as a material consideration in the planning system, I'm not sure I'd hang my hat on that one. There are better ones. We've had a few questions around sort of what's a good location for a data center and what are the locational requirements. I'm not sure we're necessarily the experts on that. Our clients would have a much better view on that. But for me, sort of trying to answer that, question number one is power. Data centers are ultimately about power, and so you can have the best location in the world, but if it hasn't got the power, then it's no use to a data center operator at all. So you've got to start with where the power connection is. Beyond that, I would say in a planning sense, you're looking for sites. Firstly, you're looking, there is a desirability to having them co-located within the availability zones, so that they can be clustered. That's key, particularly for the hyperscalers. But in terms of the site itself, these are big buildings. So you're looking probably for sites that are less visible, where you can accommodate a building of the sort of scale, the sort of height, the sort of mass that these things are without having adverse amenity impacts, whether that's landscape, visual, or other type uses. Part of the question, I think, is around whether you sort of put them near residential areas. And I think actually so far we've seen they can quite often, and Court Lane was a great example where there was an industrial estate near a residential area that was very unpopular because it was creating a lot of HGV traffic. These are generally cleaner, less traffic generating, significantly less traffic generating uses than some other industrial uses. So they can be sort of accommodated, I think, within reasonable proximity of resi. But it's a tricky question to try and answer. But start with power is key. And another question we've had is around what size is ideal. That's changing on a daily basis. And again, it's more about power than about square foot or square meters, isn't it? When we started out on this, we thought we were dealing with big data centers that were sort of maybe 50, 60, 70 megawatts. Now it's 100 megawatts. And actually, we're talking to some clients about 200 plus megawatt schemes. So it's about power. The size is driven by power rather than the physical size of the building. Actually, oddly, we're seeing the size of the buildings reduce a little bit, albeit the power requirement is going up. But certainly, if you're looking at a hyperscale, you've got to be at 100 plus megawatts, I would say, these days. So, some interest in the questions, Peter, around your 106 point that you dropped in, and the fact that no one else has picked up on it, which is a fair point. So the decision was beginning of December. I think because it's buried in one line, it's not. People haven't particularly noticed that point around the 106. But as I say, we will be doing a separate briefing note on that, and hopefully starting to raise the profile of that, because it has consequences look way beyond data center development, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said earlier, I think there are some other important things in there. We've talked on at previous outline sessions, arsenal conditions and deemed and sort of how to structure a UU in an appeal scenario. So there's some useful stuff in there.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we have just about managed to finish within our hour, which is good. Any final thoughts from you, Peter, before I close?
Not really, other than the mood music is positive, I think, for data centers, and it's only going to get bigger, I think, or smaller in terms of size, as you just mentioned. But
yeah.
yeah.
We've had, as I've said, we're about to close. We've had a few more questions come through, which I'm not going to try and answer because that will take us over our time. So apologies, but please do feel free to reach out to either me or Peter with questions. There is one question that's come through which I will answer, which is, will this video be rewatchable? Yes, it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel within the next few days, and all those of you who've watched the live broadcast will get an email with a link to that when it goes live. So we will certainly circulate that for people to watch. I like the idea someone's enjoyed it so much they want to watch it again. So that's good. But I will bring us to an end. Thank you, firstly, to everybody who's watched the live broadcast. I hope it's been useful. Please do feel free to approach us with any questions that you might have. We're very happy to talk to you more about the Court Lane decision or about sort of framework and data center planning in general. But also, Peter, thank you to you for yet again, you're a regular attender of Outline, but thank you for participating. We will be back next month, and we will be releasing details of the date and the content of the seminar next month. But in the meantime, Happy New Year to you all again, and goodbye.